All right, hello everybody. Welcome to our next lesson here. This is for our unit Urban America. This is the lesson, is called Struggles of Segregation. Objectives and standards. You will be able to understand the lives of African Americans in the late 1800s, and you will be able to recognize how African Americans were discriminated against, okay? And take a moment there to look over the standards too, please. Circling them for you now. And our desired result. How did African Americans face racism in the late 1800s? How did African Americans, face racism in the late 1800s? Some vocabulary here. We have poll tax, a tax of a fixed amount per person that had to be paid before a person could vote. Segregation, the separation or isolation of a race, class, or group. And Jim Crow laws or statutes enacted to enforce segregation. So life in the South, okay? We have already talked about life for African Americans a little bit after Reconstruction, after the Civil War, for African Americans, I should say, after the Civil War and Reconstruction. But hopefully remember that many African Americans lived in poverty in the rural South after the Civil War, and a majority of them were sharecroppers, right? We talked about sharecroppers, but sharecroppers are landless farmers who gave their landlords a large portion, of their crops to pay rent. So, in other words, they weren't really able to make money on their own. They had to give their crops to their landlords, typically their white landlords. So many African Americans couldn't get out of this system of poverty in the South. This left many African Americans in debt as well. Now, some were able to find other jobs, or some of them, I should say, moved out of the South to the West as well. And this picture here shows you some African American sharecroppers there in the background. So traveling west, during the mid-1870s, Benjamin Pap Singleton believed that African Americans would not have success in the South. You can see his picture there on the left-hand side, and he urged African Americans to move west, especially to places like Kansas where they could farm and things like that. Singleton told African Americans to form their own communities, and because of this, a mass migration or a mass movement of approximately 6,000 African Americans began. Now, they were known as exodusters. Exodusters, a term connected to the Bible. If you're religious and you're Christian or even Jewish for that matter, but if you know anything about the Bible, you might know about those who were Jewish leaving Egypt. This is a chapter in the Bible called Exodus. So that's why they kind of use that term, because they were fleeing from, whites in the South, like the Jews had, or those who were Jewish had fled from Egypt as slaves. Okay, so they're known as exodusters because of this, and they began to settle in Kansas for farming purposes. Okay. So joining alliances. Some African Americans did not travel west, but joined with poor white farmers for better rights. And the Farmers Alliance, which was a white organization, urged African Americans to form their own organization. So in 1886, African American, I should say African American, not kins, African American farmers formed the Colored Farmers National Alliance. Okay, now the group had about 1.2 million members by 1890. So in about 4 short years, which is pretty incredible, they already had about 1.2 million members. Others joined the Populist Party, which we've talked about already. Remember, the Populist Party, group of farmers looking for political and economic changes. And as African Americans join the Populist Party becomes a threat or a major problem, which created a major problem for the Democratic Party. So the Democratic Party, especially in the South, they were afraid that poor whites and African Americans could gain too much power and influence in government, and they decide they're going to take some steps to try to prevent that. So preventing the right to vote. Sorry, I'm trying, there we go. Now we're clicking there. Sorry about that. And excuse that dot down there in the bottom. To limit their power and influence, election officials began to make things more difficult for African Americans to vote. Okay, some of the things they do, or one of the things that they do, is change having to pay for the right to vote. Now, due to the 15th Amendment, states could not pass laws to prevent a person from voting, sorry, trying to get a better check mark there, from voting based on their race or ethnicity, okay? So states began to find other ways to prevent people from voting. Poll taxes. Poll taxes required that a person pay a fee before being allowed to vote. This picture here is an example of what looks like a receipt from Alabama, it looks like, April 9th, 1896. Can't really read the name there, but says that they paid, I believe it's $2 for the poll tax for the year 1895. Doesn't seem like a lot of money today, but back then that was a lot of money, especially for African Americans. And many African Americans could not afford to pay and were denied the right to vote. Okay, this also affected poor white farmers too. But reading tests were also administered in order to vote. They would make people read part of the state constitution or something else in order to be allowed to vote. And since African Americans had very little to no education in the late 1800s, many of them were turned away because they could not pass this literacy test or reading test in order to vote. Also impacted poor whites as well. You might be saying, well, aren't they kind of hurting the poor white farmers as well? Well, states decided to come up with an excuse for that, okay? They came up with what was called the Grandfather Clause. So the Grandfather Clause said that even if you couldn't afford to pay it, and you couldn't read or write for that matter, pretty much read as well, that poor whites could vote if they had an ancestor who was able to vote before 1867. Why 1867? Because that's when a lot of these amendments, especially the 15th Amendment and the Civil Rights, the Civil War amendments and all that, and Reconstruction amendments are passed, giving African Americans the right to vote. Okay, so African Americans are blocked again because obviously their ancestors were not able to vote before 1867 due to slavery and things like that. So this gives poor white farmers a way out because many of their ancestors were able to vote prior to that. So the law of segregation. While African Americans faced discrimination in the North as well, laws were more severe in the South, okay? So I don't want you to think that the North was like this great, wonderful place that African Americans were treated so great. There were laws that prevented African Americans from doing certain things in the North as well, but obviously things are more severe in the South, like I just mentioned. Many states passed laws that enforced discrimination, and these were known as Jim Crow laws. Jim Crow laws, okay? Not quite sure exactly where it comes from, but it has to do with something with African American songs or music. It's a derogatory term, basically, that enforced African Americans into segregation. African Americans and whites were separated by race in almost every public place, such as train stations, in railroad cars, in restaurants, in schools, and water fountains and restrooms were also separated by race. So whites and African Americans had to use separate restrooms and water fountains as well. So challenging racism. This man's name is Homer Plessy, and in 1892, Homer Plessy, a man with African American ancestry, you might be saying he doesn't look completely African American, but he did have some African American blood in him, and he was arrested for riding in the whites-only section of a railroad car in Louisiana. Okay, and he decides to take his fight to the Supreme Court in the case known as Plessy versus Ferguson, saying that separation by race in public places is unconstitutional. Okay? Unfortunately, the Supreme Court ruled in 1896 that the doctrine of separate but equal was constitutional. Was constitutional. Okay, so what this means is the Supreme Court says that as long as African Americans have a school, have a restroom, have a water fountain, have a place to eat in a restaurant, that's allowed. It doesn't have to, they don't have to be sitting with whites, okay? So the Supreme Court, actually our own government, kind of ruled against African Americans and said, no, we can allow segregation, and states now had the legal authority to enforce segregation, and we're going to see this has severe negative or have severe negative effects on African Americans for about 50, 60 years or so. All right, and it's not going to be until the 1960s, which we'll talk about later in class, that African Americans are going to gain finally more civil rights and equal rights as well. Okay, so our closure again. How did African Americans face racism in the late 1800s? Think about sharecropping, think about poll taxes, reading tests, also segregation in public places like railroads and restaurants and schools. All these different things are going to have difficult lives, or cause difficult lives, I should say, for African Americans in the late 1800s. All right? I hope you have a great rest of your day and night. Please try your best on the questions and let me know if you have any concerns about them, and I hope to talk to y'all soon. Take care, everyone. Bye-bye.